Hi, this is Hazard Ratio, and I'm your host, Benjamin Ryan. And this is my first go at an official podcast. I've cobbled some others together from previous interviews. But, if Ezra Klein and Derek Thompson can do it, how hard could it be, right? So my guest today is David Zweig. He's a veteran journalist, and he wrote extensively about the school lockdown policies during COVID for outlets such as Wired, The Atlantic, and New York Magazine. He's a dad living in the Hudson Valley, and he started to notice some things early in 2020 when things started to get going on the reaction to the COVID pandemic, and he went down a rabbit hole, which is something that I myself can relate to, having done the same with respects to pediatric gender medicine. So I thought we could compare and contrast a little bit between our different experiences as reporters, both what it's been like intellectually, the different comparisons between how the narratives are constructed and controlled, and the kind of blowback we've received, etc. So his book is just coming out on April 22nd, correct?
That's right.
That's right. It's called An Abundance of Caution, American Schools, the Virus, and a Story of Bad Decisions. So give me just the general elevator pitch. What's your thesis in this book? What's the main message you're sending to people?
What is the main message? It is that I guess in essence, the book is a case study of the failure of the expert class, is how I would describe it. This is ultimately a book that's not really about the pandemic. It's about something larger. I guess that all good books are supposed to be about something more than what they're about. And at least to my mind, this really is about how societies, people in power, and individuals make decisions. And so it's really kind of like an anatomy of decision making, and in particular, bad decisions. And that's part of the subtitle for my book. It's a story of bad decisions. So it's very rooted in science. That's kind of what's of particular interest to me. And I really take a great amount of time to figure out how did these people arrive at these decisions? These people meaning the public health authorities, and then by extension, it would be politicians, the media, and then ultimately individuals.
Right. And so what were those bad decisions, just in brief?
Well, the main bad decision was closing schools in America, and in particular keeping them closed for a very long time. There are more than 50 million school-age children in the United States, and a significant portion of them were out of school for more than a year. It's hard to articulate to people, to really impress upon them how crazy this was. To have this many healthy kids barred from school. And the argument I make within the book is that this wasn't a sort of fog of war type of decision, which is what the narrative has developed to now amongst the sort of mainstream kind of establishment view, is that, well, look, this is regrettable what happened, but it was understandable, during the time. And very early on in the book, I explained that that's completely false. And the purpose of my book, in some regards, that the primary mission is to show that that's false, and show that information was available in real time. This is not a sort of retrospective look. This is, here's what was known at the time, and here's why it was ignored or dismissed, and why that dismissal was incorrect.
And the basic argument was that kids will get the virus at school, take it home, give it to grandma, and kill her. That was one of the arguments. And then also the argument that kids themselves were at risk and they were going to catch it themselves at school. And so why were both of those wrong?
Well, we knew very early that kids were not as contagious as adults. That may have changed ultimately in later waves as different variants of the virus came through. But it was very clear early on that kids were not transmitting the virus as readily or easily as adults.
And how did we know this?
There were a lot of data that just epidemiological data that were coming out where they could see that kids just weren't transmitting the virus as readily and as frequently as adults. And then secondarily, we saw very early from when schools reopened in Europe that there was no impact on the community case rates. So the entire premise in the United States for why schools were kept closed was based on this idea that you just mentioned about killing grandma. Well, first, people forget there was an enormous amount of PR that kids were in grave danger, and that never really went away. It was always hovering there, and then there would be lip service paid saying, well, it's a low risk then, but it's not, but they always mention that to varying degrees. However,
I think people still carry this out with long COVID threats as well.
There's the long COVID thing.
Yeah.
So and we can get into that if you want, but then the narrative shifted a little bit from risk to children to what you pointed out, which was, well, what's the risk to the community? And that opening schools would be tremendously dangerous for the community and for children who lived in with just parents, or certainly even more so if they were living in a multi-generational home and so on. Again, we have to go back to the end of April and into May in 2020. Millions of children were in school in Europe. Millions of them. This was not like a tiny school somewhere in the middle of Timbuktu. This was Europe, and there was no noticeable impact. And this was not my opinion. There are two pieces of evidence for this. One is, and I talk about this in the book, the European Union met in May, and the education ministers...
May of 2020.
That's correct. And the
Very
education minister said, we have not observed any impact at all from schools being open. And then they met a second time in June and had the same determination. So we know that this is the official word from the European Union. Opening schools, no impact. And then secondarily, all you had to do was look at the case rates in Europe. They actually went down. Now, I'm not suggesting that schools make cases go down, of course. However, if schools were this, hotbed of viral activity of SARS-CoV-2, then you wouldn't see the cases plummeting there. You would have seen some sort of activity. So you have both of these things going together. And there are other studies and data. In Sweden, they never closed the primary schools at all. And there are studies out of Sweden very early on where they indicated there were no impacts particularly. The teachers in Sweden, they ran a study there very early, and they found they were at no higher risk than average amongst professionals. And these were, primary school teachers. They never stopped. And people are like, oh, well, Sweden's different. That's
right.
not America. That's Europe.
The windows will or will not close in one place versus another.
Stockholm is a major city, a densely crowded city. The classrooms there are, the classrooms throughout Europe, their size is roughly equivalent to what we see in most of America. I have this research in the book where I looked up, the average number of students in a classroom. Population densities in all sorts of cities throughout Europe and towns match counterparts in America. There were many, many things going on that made it just completely fallacious, this assertion that what we were observing in Europe was somehow so wildly different from America that it was irrelevant, that we were supposed to just ignore it. It was manifestly ridiculous on its face, yet nevertheless, tons of public health professionals kept saying this, and the media would just report it without any attempt whatsoever at actually investigating these claims. And that's a big thrust of my book, is the media's failure, along with the public health experts, to actually present the real evidence to the public.
So I'd like to draw a parallel there between your field of study and pediatric gender medicine, because there are 5 European nations, basically all of Scandinavia plus United Kingdom, that have at least sharply restricted access to gender transition treatment for minors. That's puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones. And this has been accomplished because they have either conducted or looked at systematic literature reviews, which are the highest form of scientific evidence, and found that there's a very low quality of evidence supporting these interventions. And accordingly, their national health authorities have made these decisions. So with the exception of part of what's going on in the United Kingdom, they've all been done outside of politics. So there's a kind of exceptionalism that you see certainly in the media where this isn't even mentioned. And they'll say things like all major U.S. medical associations agree that this is the standard of care, even though that's not exactly true either. But they won't even mention what's going on in Europe, and to describe this as uncontroversial. So I think you see that also in law. I think the Supreme Court is often very reticent to make reference to other countries' law or national law, like where the exception, United States exceptionalism, we shouldn't have to kowtow to other people. So I definitely saw a strong parallel there, and I'm curious to know, I can see how the system, we don't have that kind of top-down national health authority with respects to these kind of medical guidelines in pediatric gender medicine that they have in Europe. So what was it about the U.S. system that nevertheless was very almost authoritarian, as you characterize in your book, and how did the system work so that it ignored what's going on in Europe? What's different about Europe that allowed them to open schools and to look more precisely at this evidence as you're describing it, whereas in the United States it just became this sort of mess?
Well, I think it's less to do with the public health establishment and more to do with the culture. And the United States was and is now just an extraordinarily
live free or die kind of. Well,
I'm just saying politically, it's extremely, and this is an observation. It's an extremely acrimonious, very, very divided country, and the thrust of my thesis is that because Donald Trump wanted schools to open, the only acceptable position on the left, and the left composes most of the public health establishment, most of the media establishment. So the only acceptable position among these people was to go against Trump. Yeah, this is how they think. These people weren't interested or capable of actually evaluating the evidence.
And you talk about, it was July that the all caps tweet came out from President Trump saying, right, open the schools. And then within a week, I think the American Academy of Pediatrics switched its tune.
That's right. Yeah, and it was so obvious that even NPR reported on this sort of about face from the American Academy of Pediatrics. So it's, the environment in America was as such that these people, and this is not the only reason, but it's a critical reason about why they continued to perpetuate a policy that was clearly harmful, that clearly didn't have any benefit, but they continued it nonetheless. It's an extraordinary moment. I don't think we've reckoned with it sufficiently. And as you and I talked about before the podcast, there are some interesting parallels, I think, to what you've reported on and observed with gender medicine. And obviously I'd like to hear your thoughts on this. But to me, Ben, it's like there's something America, and I don't know if there are data to back this up or not. It would probably be challenging to study, although not necessarily. You'd have to look at rates of different types of procedures, and then you'd have to account for insurance and all sorts of other confounding variables. But my assertion is that America is a uniquely interventionist medical culture. And there are probably a variety.
I think you hear that a lot. There's a pill for it.
Right.
This is the basis of the international pharmaceutical market. We get all the drugs first. We pay the highest dollar for them. Right. So there's the biggest profit be made by pushing drugs in this country. No other country totally lacks, with the exception of 10 drugs on Medicare per year, the ability to negotiate prices.
Yeah, and I think a lot of it's financial, but I think there's other cultural pieces as well. And there's something in the American character, I think, that there's just this uniquely aggressive approach to medicine. That obviously to become a doctor, there's the first do no harm mantra that they are taught. But the reality is that's not how it often works in American medicine. And by medicine, I'm extending that to public health as well.
Well, you talk about there's a maxim amongst ER doctors which flips that, which is don't just do something, stand there.
Yeah, right. So I love
which really
that
turns it
quote.
on its head. The
I
harms
love that
of interventions.
It's so important to sometimes do nothing, and that we do iatrogenesis is a word for harm from the intervention itself. And unfortunately, that is what happened during the pandemic. And you can speak to this, but it seems as though that's certainly the case with a lot of the gender medicine amongst kids, where instead of having some humility and saying, this is a big deal. These are children. Maybe we shouldn't intervene, with medicine, let alone with surgeries that are irreversible. They're just full steam ahead, and we're really an anomaly on the world stage with that. You can correct me if I'm wrong, but
it's certainly out front. And I mean, most of the leaders in the gender medicine field are the United States. The quote-unquote World Professional Association for Transgender Health, or WPATH, is a misnomer of a title because it's largely a U.S.-based organization. There's some people in Europe, but it's largely run out of the United States. So these are, for the most part, ideas that they started in the Netherlands, but that was really a very small pilot project. But they were really popularized and liberalized the most by American doctors.
Yeah.
But something that you see in your book, which is very similar in gender medicine, is this idea that doing nothing is not a neutral act. And so they turn it on its head. You call it action bias or intervention bias, where typically if you propose an intervention, be it we're going to keep kids out of school or we're going to give kids blockers and hormones and surgeries before they turn 18 for gender transition, then typically you would have to prove that that's safe and effective. And importantly, that it represents a balance of risk versus benefits. Instead, what I've observed in the way that gender medicine has been rolled out in the last couple decades is, essentially it was rolled out on the cover of Dark. No average people had never heard of this. This was very obscure. Very few children ever got this until the early to mid 2010s. And then when, say, Jesse Singal starts to write about it, The Atlantic, 2018, people start to get wind of it and they're alarmed by this. Then there's the immediate pushback from the powers that be in this medical field is, how dare you question this? And it is up to you to prove that we should not give this to children. And then you'll get GLAAD, the LGBT media watchdog organization, claiming that science is settled. So all of a sudden the onus is on anybody who questions this to prove that not giving it is the better option. Where instead of saying, like you're saying, having some humility, acknowledging this is a very radical intervention, we're suggesting channeling somebody into the opposite puberty. But here's how we think this represents a balance of the risk versus benefits. And so much of that I heard, throughout your book, that sort of lack of humility and lack of acknowledging what we're doing. Keeping kids out of school was a radical act for an entire year. And, it started out in the beginning, it's just to flatten the curve for a while. But as you're saying, there was no end game. Well, and then what?
Yeah, there was no end game. There was no plan. They had no idea what they were doing. It was, in my view, reasonable but wrong to close schools at all, period, even from day one.
But there's that argument of we only knew what we knew at the time, so can you give them some credit for at least a couple months until May, let's say?
I said it was reasonable but wrong. So but where it became unreasonable was after a few weeks in a very select locations where there even was a big spike in cases of COVID. In New York City, by the end of April, hospitalizations in cases had fallen like 50%. I think April 10th was the peak for there. So by the end of April, like the curve had been flattened. Like there was no ambiguity about it. It wasn't like, well, it's like, I mean, it like went down like the side of like the side of a mountain. There was no confusion about what was happening with cases, and we were told, as you recall, we're doing this to flatten the curve. Mm-hmm. We have to prevent the hospitals from being overwhelmed. Well, we did it. Mm-hmm. But then they said, we're going to just keep doing this anyway. So it was kind of astonishing to me how easily people went along with the sort of, to use a cliche, the moving of the goalposts. Mm-hmm. There was some pushback, but when I say people, I guess I'm mostly referring to the kind of like left mainstream elite culture and just sort of the left broadly, even outside the elites, that people were full steam ahead with the just repeated extensions of these policies, even though the stated mission of the policy had already been accomplished. Mm-hmm. So they changed the mission of what these things were supposed to do, and everyone said, yeah, let's just keep doing this. Again, and this is in the face of direct evidence that this wasn't beneficial.
And you also talk about there really wasn't, among the various powers that be, and this includes these sort of consultants about risk, includes the teachers' unions and people in the public health sector, the journalists, etc., the teachers themselves, the administrators in the schools, the CDC. No one among them had a vested interest in keeping kids in school. They were all biased in one direction. Like you're like the one guy out there in the rain screaming in the other direction. And I see that a lot. The members of WPATH and within the pediatric gender medicine field, as you well know, within the evidence-based medicine field, a big push in that is when you're devising guidelines for a treatment is you don't want your guidelines committee entirely stocked of people who have a vested interest in furthering their own field of study. There's a financial interest, there's a reputation interest. So you want to get some dispassionate people or just geeks who know about medicine and science and math to come in there, and they have no interest one way or another about how this goes down. Right. And so that's something you see, and you'll see like in these emails that have been exposed through the Alabama Attorney General that were got by subpoena last year and published last summer, that behind closed doors, they're ensuring that all the people on their guidelines committee all have an intellectual conflict of interest. That's actually a requirement to be on the committee. They think this is necessary. So this is directly in conflict with what the evidence-based medicine movement is trying to do. So you speak a lot about that. Talk about how did the evidence-based movement, how was it not observed? How did it essentially fail this time in history?
Yeah, a lot of the book is about evidence-based medicine and kind of just pulling the lens back. It's really philosophical. It's like an epistemological journey, if you will, where it's asking how do you know what is true?
Yeah.
How do you know, how do we evaluate evidence? And within medicine, there's a thing called a hierarchy of evidence. And this is the foundation.
Pyramid.
Yeah.
What's down here, Dave?
That's right, down at the bottom.
Expert opinion.
That's at the bottom. So
what's up here?
Right.
Randomized trial. Systematic literature reviews.
That's right. That's right. Meta-analyses and systematic reviews. So, the way the pandemic response was rolled out was just based on opinion. There were no random, and importantly, the authorities made no effort to actually produce quality data, which is like incredibly important. So they had this thing based on opinion, based on just kind of intuitions and assumptions, which, okay, maybe for week number 1 or something you can do that, or week number 2 is you're, not sure. Let's just try something when we're uncertain about what's going on. But while you're doing that, there's an immediate obligation to start gathering real evidence that you can use to gain an understanding. And there was zero effort made for that.
Well, so you say that there have been 56,169 NIH grants for COVID, $2.2 billion, and that 6 were to study the efficacy of social distancing and none to study the efficacy of masking in kids. And I think something you hear often in pediatric general medicine is there's no equipoise, which is when there's ethical balance when you conduct a study, because we already know this works. There have been enough lower quality evidence studies, and they're all pointing in one direction. And they never mention like, oh, they all could be biased for the same reason, mind you. Therefore, we can't deny a treatment that we all know very well is going to save these kids' lives. I don't know if I heard a lot of that in your book, but was that part of the argument of like why we can't do any randomized controlled trials of masking in kids or et cetera, is that we might just be killing everyone and their grandmother?
I mean, there's this person named Kim Prather who I mentioned a number of times in the book. She's, I'm going to get this wrong, but she's like a aerosol type of scientist person. I mean, and repeatedly, she was quite prominent during the pandemic, and repeatedly she kept saying, dismissing the idea, we don't need randomized trials. This is just basic science. We know that
physics.
Masks work. This is basic physics. Come on. You can't even question this. And the whole purpose of randomized data, as you know, is that observational data is often wrong. We don't know. You could have, I don't care if there are 1,000 observational studies all pointing in one direction. They may have the same confounders. Like you need to actually randomize and do things in a proper scientific way to really gain an understanding. And in the book, I give tons of examples of where medical intuition, where doctors were wrong, and things that to a regular person would seem quite intuitive and quite obvious. There are so many things.
Right.
So I appreciate why a regular person would be like, well, it seems kind of obvious that that like a mask is going to reduce transmission, or it seems obvious that closing schools is going to be effective. I understand why that seems the way it is, but many, many things in medicine and public health aren't the way they seem.
So one example.
That's why we need proper randomized data, and they never bothered to do it.
One example you gave that I learned about myself about a year ago from reading The Interpretive Maladies is the radical mastectomy. So that was a surgery. It was created in the late 19th century, in which not only for breast cancer did they take out a woman's breast, but a lot of the local muscle, the pectoral muscle, the lymph nodes, etc. So it was very disfiguring. Betty Ford had it in the 1970s while she was First Lady. And for decades, so many of these surgeons, surgeons not a stranger to the ego, were so certain that this was better, that, that you had to be as aggressive as possible, that the cancer spread out from the area, etc. And so that meant when they finally tried to establish some randomized controlled trials during the 1970s, it was very hard to recruit anyone, the doctors or the patients. And it was a 10-year process. And then ultimately, they did prove that there was no difference in outcomes between that and a much more limited surgery, a lumpectomy or ordinary mastectomy. And the important difference in being one was incredibly disfiguring and the other was not. So that hit me really hard. Also, there was the case of high-dose chemo and stem cell transplant, which was very popular a little bit after that in history. And it turns out that it was all created because this guy in South Africa fabricated his data. And no one bothered to check for a little while. And ultimately, it became the standard of care, in no small part because of tort law, because people were afraid of lawsuits, so they started covering it. And myself, survivor of not just cancer, but chemotherapy, if my cancer recurs, that is what I would have to have. So when I was reading that book and reading what exactly high-dose chemotherapy and a stem cell transplant is like, I was sitting there in peril, and it really hit home for me of how personal that feels. Like, do you have any idea what chemotherapy is like, and then what it is like for the rest of your life, and what that does to your body? Causes me neuropathy, memory lapses, that kind of thing. So I do take this very personally when people are just throwing around this idea of we don't need to prove something. Like, well, it couldn't hurt, because there are costs to treating things, to over-treating things.
Of course. And again, I keep going back to this. Our intuition is often wrong. the things that seem obvious. Oh, of course, of course we need to do a radical mastectomy. These things that seem like the answer is already known are over and over and over again has proven to not be the case once they actually have done the proper studies. So it's just so important that people understand how there is just a complete kind of they just reached sort of escape velocity from following evidence-based medicine. And then, like, what's interesting is, like, there just are so many parallels, it seems, to the gender-based medicine. You may disagree. As far as I think the extent of damage is infinitely more during the pandemic.
Well, sure, of course, numerically,
yeah, numerically, but
this provided one presumes that damage is being done.
You presume that, do you not?
It's not my place to presume that or state publicly, but what
yes,
I can
it is. Come on,
it isn't. I'm not here to take position on that. But what I can say, it is very clear that the science, the cart's out before the horse, in terms of the science versus how thoroughly they've sought to roll out a standard of care, and they're really upfront about it. Jack Turbin, he's a leading child psychiatrist, UCSF, stated very clearly in his book that he thinks that they should do away with the biopsychosocial assessments, to determine whether this is the right fit for any of these kids. Well, at the same time, he'll contradict himself, in a paper that he published in an op-ed he published that same month that his book came out, saying, "Don't worry, we're all doing these biopsychosocial assessments." In the same month, he publishes a paper that says that the very first bullet point on how you're supposed to conduct these assessments is it's not to determine if the kids are really trans. So there's all this contradicting going on, and it's so obvious to me that the very first question you would want to determine is whether the kid is really trans, because you would require that to determine that this is the best intervention for them, provided you have determined that this is a best intervention for anyone.
Right.
So what's obvious and what I can say for certain is that the science is not there to establish the certainty with which certain people speak about their field, and the aggression with which they push back on anyone who questions this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it's just the gender stuff is definitely far more kind of out there. As far as like the people who really support it, I think is probably quite small relative to people during the pandemic who thought it was appropriate to do all these other stuff, with the mask mandates and so on. So, but
similarly, there's a consistency across a lot of liberal media to support it. So you would not be blamed for having the impression that most people think this is a good idea, that it's the standard of care, and that it is indeed life-saving, despite the fact that there is no evidence to support that claim.
Yeah. There's almost like a sense of bullying, I feel, and they're from these people. And when I say these people, I mean the health establishment, but also a lot of the media. And that's and I think there's just such a strong tribalism within the United States amongst these people that they get into their bubble, and there's a degree of righteousness among them that no one can even disagree with that. You're a monster if you disagree with someone.
I don't think you say there's a degree of there. It's as if there's bullying. There is bullying, and they use X as their enforcement mechanism. This day they use Blue Sky. I've been accused of so many things under the sun on both settings by other journalists and by other sort of just liberal-minded people. And can you speak to a bit to the kind of blowback that you've received, be it in your community, from your family or friends, or whoever it might be, to the kind of reporting that you've done?
Yeah, I mean, early on, when we were trying to get schools open, people in the local parents' Facebook group in my town, people were writing stuff like, "Why do you want to murder children?" And, why are you trying to kill teachers? And also, I mean, it's so. For sure, the people are just so generally are so uninformed. The people in this house, we believe in science, lawn signs, those people actually didn't know anything. They knew nothing about the science. They had no freaking clue what they were talking about. So there's such a smugness and arrogance amongst a lot of these people. It's really, really abrasive and a turnoff, for lack of a better expression, to have to interact with people who think and behave in this manner. Just the degree of certainty of their own righteousness is just incredibly tiring to deal with people like that. It's incredibly ungenerous and anti-intellectual to think and behave in that manner. So
here we are, though. We're in Trump 2. There's been a lot of, shall we say, memory holding of the left's, the liberal left's excesses, silencing people, that sort of thing, or people excusing it, saying, well, this is orders of magnitude worse, the kind of suppression of the truth that's going on, the kind of attacks on academia that are happening outside of the White House. What's your take on sort of left versus right when it comes to science? And, we've seen Peter Marks out of the FDA. He, I guess he was pushed out, but, he said that RFK was a liar, suppressing the truth. We saw in the past few days a nutrition researcher, NIH scientist, quit because he said that people in position of authority and HHS were trying to manipulate the kind of research that he thought that people like RFK would like. We're looking at things that you eat that make you sick, make America healthy again. And yet that didn't seem to please them because they had predetermined outcomes, apparently. So he quit in protest. He retired early. What's your take on one side versus the other, if you will, when it comes to their approach to science and truth?
Well, I just don't even think of it in those terms.
Sure.
I just view it as there are foolish people in both or all ends of the political spectrum. But when it comes to science, the majority of the people in this, in public health fields tend to lean left. Some of them dramatically so, and so that's what matters. I feel like, do people on the right do science better? I don't know. Maybe not. But what we do know is that the health establishment is composed of people on the left primarily, particularly when we're looking
you're getting an oversampling of their opinions no matter what. So
right, and the way they behaved during the pandemic showed a tremendous divorce from following evidence-based practice. My book, the examples are numerous and distinct, and to my mind, incredibly persuasive to the argument that they were just completely not following what you should be doing in science. There was this, what I talk about in the book, there was this kind of favoring of theory over empiricism, that, well, we believe such and such, we think, although they didn't even use those words. They just said, they never said, well, we think such and, why we don't have to listen to Europe. They just made shit up and said it. Well, that's because Europe is controlling the virus. That's why they can open school. They were just making shit up. So I understand my far left friends who I have. I understand their concerns and frustrations with Trump administration. I understand, some of them are apoplectic over the lies, et cetera, but for me, I find the way that the health establishment has behaved to be far more problematic and disappointing, because there's this veneer and perception, at least among some people, of those people being above this. That they're
you can never be subject to biases of any kind.
Yeah,
they're always empirical, that sort of thing.
They're on the left. They're the good people, et cetera, et cetera. So to me, it's almost more dangerous. It's more upsetting. I'm far more worried about those people not actually being honest than I am about Trump. I think most people perceive Trump and politicians in general and others through a particular lens. They're sort of expecting a certain amount of BSing and spin. But I think people certainly have their guard lowered quite a bit more when you have a physician or a public health person like an epidemiologist or others giving some sort of pronouncement on one.
And yet RFK, no medical training, is doing just that, making all these claims about autism this past week. What's your take about that?
Yeah, I mean, I would just say that I'm not familiar with the literature on that topic. It seems
many autism, nor am I, but many autism experts criticize what he said greatly.
I'd have to look at the data myself.
Yeah.
It seems as though he's overstating, with certainty himself.
Certainly claiming that you're going to find the source of the autism epidemic by September.
Yeah, that sounded. Yeah, I mean, I don't see how.
I don't know if you're familiar with the way the academic publishing works, but
yeah, of course. Yeah. I mean, maybe he was saying that with a little bit purposeful hyperbole. I don't know.
Yeah.
But here's the thing: it's like you can think that RFK is kind of way out there on autism and vaccines and some other stuff, and vehemently disagree with him on that. But that doesn't mean he's wrong when he talks about trying to get chemicals out of food,
sure,
and worrying about obesity and a variety of other things. But there's such like a kind of childish type of framing that happens within the media and sort of the smart set in America. Everything becomes so binary that there's just heroes and villains, and that's it. And RFK Jr. is a person like anyone else, and he's neither a saint nor a monster. And you should be able to take the things that he says that are valid and go along with them and criticize the things that he says that you don't think are valid. But RFK is just painted as just this fool, crazy person. And it doesn't matter even if he says things that are perfectly reasonable and smart that other public health people have failed to really take on. So it's just, and that's, reminds me of pandemic stuff as well. So
I want to segue into the loss of trust in authorities and medical and public health authorities in the media. And you talk about this in your book, and this is something that I see as well in the trans kids space, is this disparity between what everyday people were seeing in their everyday lives and then what they're being told by these cultural elites. And certainly we've heard a lot right after the election. Seth Moulton and Tom Swazi came out and they made these remarks about the trans inclusion in kids' sports, saying that they didn't want their kid being run over on the schoolyard by somebody of the opposite sex on their kid's school team. And you hear a lot thrown around that, there's only 5 trans sports participants in the NCAA, which may be true, but it is my impression that it's quite common in middle schools in particular, that this is a generational shift that is migrating up very quickly through those age ranges, and that parents are seeing this a lot on the school fields. So, and they're having a reaction to it, and they might feel this is unfair, but they're being told they cannot question this, and that their intuition is a bigoted one. And I think that their reaction, that can very much radicalize people. For one thing, it creates mistrust. How do you know what I feel? Anyone in the right mind would feel this way. So I think that creates a distance between what they're willing to listen to from media elites. And so I think you speak to a lot of the similarities where people are looking around saying, I'm not seeing these morgues filled with children, for example, and I'm being told that we're at such grave risk. And many people, I myself, do not know anyone who died of COVID. Very old guy in my dance studio who I took class with twice, who was, very ill as it was, died of COVID. That's like the closest I can get, and I know a lot of people.
Wait a minute. What kind of dances?
Oh,
What dance were you doing?
I was a long time student of ballet. But I stopped during the pandemic, and then I discovered the joy of not having your left hip hurting all the time. So I retired from the ballet studio. But and I myself didn't really know, and maybe it's because I have an undersampling of people over 70 in my life.
It's not. I mean, statistically, it depends what age. What time duration we want to look at. But over a period of time, even if we, 1 million deaths, I forget when we reached that point of 1 million COVID deaths.
I remember the New York Times cover. It was about a year, I think.
Like a year into it or something. So even after that, there's 330 plus million people in America. So that means like 1 out of every 330 people. And of that 1 person out of 330, the vast majority of them were quite old. So the likelihood that you or any given person is going to know somebody who died of COVID is quite low. You might know of someone. Everyone has.
That's the best I can do. But
most people have large enough networks, or I shouldn't say most, but a lot of people.
What I did know is there were 2 people who I was very close to. One drank herself to death, and the other one died of a fentanyl overdose.
Well, right. There's that.
There's that.
I mean, right. These are the sort of other effects. But so we know that just statistically speaking, it just wasn't that likely. And I do, as you noted, I talk about this in the book, that ultimately there was such a disconnect from what the average person was experiencing versus what they were being told was actually happening. It was this sort of Daniel Boorstin pseudo event to some extent. This isn't to say that COVID isn't real and that many people died. So I'm not.
We're talking about degrees. The degree of the crisis.
We're talking about statistics and probabilities, and the reality is that out of 330 million people, the likelihood that anyone was going to be very close to someone you might know, of a friend, or a relative, or someone such and such, but to have a personal, close relationship with someone who died of COVID would, just statistically speaking, be quite rare. And ultimately, people were fed up, or at least a lot of people were, with being told that their whole life had to be turned upside down for this thing that was really not a significant risk to them, particularly children, relative to all sorts of other risks that we face in life.
I think that the rise of Moms for Liberty, we've seen how this has become very political. The parents' rights movement, we saw that in the election in Virginia. Virginia always has that off-year election as sort of the harbinger of which way the wind is blowing. And so that, and also with trans issues, parents become upset that their kids are being taught one thing or another about gender and sexuality. So I think that those 2 things really did merge with our 2 subjects when it came to parents' rights and that sort of fighting for having control over your kids' schooling. And it also created an exodus of kids being sent to private school as well.
Yeah. I think you're on point with that. So it's very challenging to kind of for people. Most people are quite innumerate and are very, very bad at assessing risk, including me, I'm sure, in plenty of circumstances. We all do, sort of irrational. By the way, I just took a peek. Even now in 2025, it says there were 1.19 confirmed deaths in the United States from COVID. Yeah, 1.1 million. Anyway, so um, it's just statistically speaking, this is just not a likely thing. Again, I'm not suggesting that it's not dangerous for some people, but so are many things. Here's the thing. We're also getting off track from what really matters here, which is whether COVID killed, 1 million people or 20 million in the United States, which it didn't. But I'm saying, like, even if the real question is whether these interventions work or not.
Well, so in the future, for whatever problem we might face, be that a pandemic or something else, in the case...
But I guess the thing that's frustrating is, because I've been met with this type of reaction many, many times from people where I'm like talking about school closures and stuff. They say, do you know how many people died? And it's like, well, that's irrelevant. That actually has nothing to do...
Why is that irrelevant?
Because it has nothing to do with whether the interventions worked or not.
Okay. Whether
it's 1 million or 10 million or 20, that still doesn't mean that closing schools was effective. It still doesn't mean
what's relevant is is there a connection between those two? That's
right. Then maybe we can talk. Then it's like, all right, but I mean, this happened like a month ago. I was getting my haircut. I was talking with the haircutter about the book coming out, and I'm like, look, closing schools was a net harm to children in America. It just wasn't. In fact, and I hear this voice, that's not true. So I'm like, what? Where did that come from?
I literally wrote the book on it, lady.
Right. Lady, there's just some woman. She's like, that's not true. It's just some woman who overheard me. And I'm like, it is. And she's like, you don't know anything about this. I'm like, actually, I wrote a book about it. Press, so yes, I do. And she's like, oh, well. And then, but nevertheless, she said, do you know someone who died from COVID? Mm-hmm. And I said, no, I know of 1 or 2 people, but not personally. And she said, you'd feel differently if you knew someone who died from COVID. Mm-hmm. My husband had COVID. He almost died. It was incredibly bad. And this is the mindset. I'm like, that doesn't matter. That's an irrelevant fact
an emotional
to whether or not these interventions are effective or not. But people's brains, they're just like not able to parse that. It's incredibly frustrating to try to communicate with someone like that.
Right. So I assume part of why you wrote this book is you would like there to be some sort of a reckoning, your version of the 9/11 Commission or what have you. I don't know,
My book is the reckoning.
There hasn't been a lot of reckoning in various formats, be it in government or media. Are you as pessimistic as I am about a reckoning? Like, what do you think will happen in the next coming years with our assessing of what happened during that period?
Well, it's funny. I was my earpiece keeps coming out. I was talking with our friend Zach about this earlier
Our friend
today.
Zach Bisonet, who I like to, I've said to him, he's also a former journalist turned hedge funder, but I call him the science journalist whisperer. And he said, no, I'm the science journalist berater. I'm like, you sure are, Zach.
Yeah,
Zach spent the entire pandemic yelling at every science journalist he could find until they were browbeaten into agreeing with him about essentially your perspective.
Yeah, I was going to say, Zach was correct. But anyway, and as far as the reckoning is concerned, here's the thing. When you think about 9/11 and a variety of other debacles or catastrophes that have occurred, there was some sort of, well, we weren't talking about reckoning. We were talking about like who became kind of like an all-star journalist, who became famous from these various events. The thing is, the left in America were the ones who screwed up on this, at least in regards to school closures and a variety of these other interventions. I would argue the whole broader pandemic response.
I think a good comparison is that between Florida and California, age-adjusted death rates were comparable, essentially, despite vastly different approaches.
Excess death. Yeah, but I think also even COVID deaths may have been similar.
Yeah, I think it was COVID death. I mean, if you read, Alec McGillis wrote a really powerful article that was such a turning point for me in ProPublica. I can't remember exactly when it came out in the course of the pandemic, but he described these 2 school districts. I think that one was in New Mexico and one was right at the border of New Mexico and Texas, and the other was in Texas. Mm-hmm. So they were essentially the same types of communities, but they had the opposite approach to COVID. Mm-hmm. And there's just this point of catharsis where like the star quarterback, like the every boy that everyone loved, commits suicide. And it was just so heartbreaking. I remember where I was listening to it while I was doing laundry, listening to it on one of those audio things, and I was just devastated. But it told a story in a way that numbers can't. Even if ultimately that's an anecdote, and you have to zoom out to make sure you're not just getting a biased sample. Could have been fluke. But that told me a story. I'm so far removed from high school myself. Like, God, can you imagine if you couldn't do theater when you were a kid? This kid's pulled out of football, everything that meant something to him. And I think it was because kids can't vote. It was a lot easier, I think, one could argue, to take things from them. Is you're saying, like, the bars were open, but not the schools. What's up with that? And also, kids don't contribute to the economy, except for maybe a little bit, some after-school jobs. I think those major factors kept them from having as much of a voice of saying, hey, what about us? This is costing us something.
Yeah. I think you're right on that. But I want to, just return for one moment. Mm-hmm. So, in your mind, do you see that there's something unique about the American medical establishment? I don't know if we can draw a pattern from the pandemic and gender medicine stuff to, if two examples are sufficient, but the parallels are quite striking.
Well,
and
yeah.
I'm just, in your view, why is it that the U.S. medical establishment has had a different response and approach relative to that in Europe with gender medicine? Why? What's your opinion on why is that?
Well, you talk about the teachers unions and how they're there to represent the needs of teachers. Sure, the teachers are there to support the kids, but first and foremost, they're for the benefit of the careers and the safety of the wants and the needs of the teachers. Mm-hmm. And you see something very similar with that with all the different medical societies in the United States, the American Academy of Pediatrics, the AMA, and all of the, on down the list. Mm-hmm. Whereas in the United Kingdom, there's the NHS. They run the show, and so there's a real top-down authority, and they can dispassionately analyze the evidence and come up with reports, and they make decisions on behalf of the whole country. And people may not like that, but NHS is generally quite popular. Whereas in the United States, we don't have something very similar. I think perhaps COVID was an anomaly in that regard, where we did see some of that going on, as you're describing, Fauci, Birx, et cetera, on down. But by and large, medical policies are set by small committees of special interests within these medical societies. So within the American Academy of Pediatrics, their policy statement on the gender-affirming care method was published in 2018. It was written by a single resident, this guy Jason Rafferty. He was a medical resident at the time, Jason Rafferty, and it was edited by a small committee. But this wasn't voted on by the entirety of the American Academy of Pediatrics. And then the other medical societies sort of looked to that. And despite the fact that there's been this fact check of it by another researcher, finding that it's riddled with errors, that it contradicts, that some of its citations contradict it or don't support what it's saying. They've never corrected it. But all of the other medical societies follow suit because they assume, the AAP knows what they're doing. They're the ones that kids. Dave, just so you know, you're out of focus.
I don't know what happened. It's just it's so bizarre.
I don't know what happened.
So strange.
Oh, there you're back.
Hey, all right, I'm back. I don't know why or how that happened. Anyway, that was exciting.
Yeah. So you see how just a small
was so powerful, Ben, that it
went out of focus. You see how small groups of people with a vested interest in their own career can advocate for something, and there's no real check on that. And I was working on an article that ultimately got killed a couple of years ago for a publication in which I was interviewing slews of pediatricians about their approach to and their impression of pediatric gender medicine. And essentially there were two camps that I was looking at, and it was kind of a snowballing effect, sampling effect, because I was basically getting a couple people to recommend to me all the skeptics. And so it was a biased sample, mind you, but all the skeptics had essentially done all the reading, which is an enormous amount of reading, similar to what you did when you really went down the rabbit hole with this subject about COVID. Doing the reading to understand pediatric gender medicine takes, it took me like a year to really be immersed into it. So they had the time for this for one reason or another, and that was what had fomented their skepticism, among other things. Whereas the other people said, well, I trust the American Academy of Pediatrics and their general policy on it, and if I have concerns about a kid, I'll just refer them to the gender clinic because they're the experts. So they're deferring responsibility to these people who are themselves responsible for creating these guidelines that buttress their own careers. So that sort of intellectual conflict of interest, I think, is at the core of where things can really go wrong.
Do you think that the people who are doing this stuff, who are operating on a little kid, for quote gender affirming kid, do you think that what percentage of them do you think believe, even in the face of evidence, in like very different viewpoint out of a number of countries in Europe? What percentage of them do you think believe that they're 100% certain that this is the right thing to do?
I know what they'll say is that my patients are all satisfied. They come back, they're doing so much better in school. So you'll hear that expert opinion a lot. I can't speak for what they think, but I can speak to what they say. But one thing, when it comes to some of the evidence-based medicine lessons that you're describing, the lost in this, is, and there's this woman named Rita Kaltiala, and she headed up one of the two main pediatric gender clinics in Finland. It was established in 2011, and she came into it somewhat skeptical but open, and over the years became more and more skeptical, and then she started doing the research to essentially back up what her impressions were. And there was an immense amount of blowback when she recently said that some of the benchmarks that they were looking at were, did you leave the house? Do you have a job? Do you have a romantic partner? And you talk about this with what's called Campbell's Law in your book, where when we focus on essentially what's a biomarker, or we look at the case rate as opposed to morbidity and mortality, that's what's really important. But when we obsess over case positivity rate or the case rate, that's one degree removed, which what we actually care about, which is, are people suffering and dying?
Right.
And so it was very interesting to see the kind of blowback when, instead of saying, like, are these kids, when we look at them in these anxiety scales, are they sad, are they anxious? But when we look at real metrics in life, like, how are you doing in life? Like, are you getting out of that? Are you in the basement?
Right.
It was very telling how much pushback there was on that. Like, she was moving the goalposts. I'm like, no, I think that what she was doing was she was moving away from something that's the result of a form that you fill out to something that has really real world implications, which is, how are you doing in life? And is there any association between the interventions that we've given you and your doing better or worse? And she essentially found that there were none, on balance.
So then what would you say if someone said, but then how come all these doctors are having this sort of clinical experience that's different with their patients?
I think one thing you hear is that, well, you hear a lot of people who detransition, who stop their medical transition and reverse it, etc., go back to identifying and presenting as their birth sect or something in between, is that those people often don't alert their former doctors. So there's that kind of a bias.
Skewed sample.
You get a skewed sample. The happier patients, you might not see them for very long afterwards. The follow-up in the studies tends to be very short. If there's any real follow-up at all, if they're not just cross-sectional, it tends to be no more than 12 months. So, but that said, I do have to acknowledge that there is one major study run by Christina Olson out of Princeton, and they've been following kids who they socially transitioned largely before the age of 6, average age of 6. And now there's, a couple hundred kids in this cohort, and they've been followed into adolescence, and, a lot of them have had these gender treatments. And so they seem to be doing well. Very few of them have reversed it. But this is not a representative sample of the typical child that's entering gender clinics today. They started this study following these kids, about 10 years ago, and so much has changed in the culture since then. And today, the typical kid minor who presents at a gender clinic is a natal female who only started expressing, at least, gender dysphoria or discomfort about their gender versus their sex after they started puberty. Whereas prior to that, in prior generations, it was a very rare phenomenon that was largely seen in natal boys. And then largely those boys grew up to be gay men. There were some of them who were lifelong transsexuals, as the term used to be. So I guess to wrap up, what do you hope people will get out of your book? Do you hope there will be any policy changes out of it?
I hope that people, it's only through, I think, kind of having the sort of journey as you go through a book like mine, where there's just, as I kind of craft this chronology and take people on this tour, if you will, of what happened, that you really can internalize an understanding. We can have an intellectual sense about things, but it's only until you either experience it, or one step removed, be reading about something extensively, that it's only that you can really internalize the ways in which the quote-unquote experts were so removed from actually behaving like scientists. And there was a whole variety.
And also the laptop class phenomenon, as you're saying.
Class.
Yeah, these people weren't related to essential workers and supermarket checkout.
Yeah, I mean,
people.
It's the people who made the rules were a very different type of class than many of the people who then
in the slaughterhouses.
People who then were under, a significant portion of Americans do not live the way that Anthony Fauci lives, or, just your sort of run-of-the-mill kind of physician or epidemiologist at some university. They're in a different strata, and their lifestyle, their experience is very, very different from many Americans, but yet only one type of that, this one strata were the ones making the rules. So what I try to show people within the book, and that I hope someone will come away with after reading it, is like, well, first of all, I hope it's fun isn't the right word, but I hope it's a really engaging read. That I really took a lot of time trying to.
There's a lot of zeal. You're definitely passionate.
That's good.
If not enraged.
Not enraged, but just passionate and engaged, and I try to have a historical lens on a lot of things, and I go into, as you may remember, I talk about John Locke and David Hume, and we're sort of looking back and to try to contextualize what happened, and for people to just have an understanding on a deep level about how evidence works, and how that quote experts combined with the media have a way of presenting a veneer of certainty and of truthfulness that's actually totally unearned and inappropriate. And once you really see this on this topic, you can't help but wonder about any number of other topics where we're just told, well, the experts are saying blah, blah, blah.
Yeah, that's definitely a phenomenon for any journalist who's an expert in one subject. And you see other people write about it, and you're just dying because of all the errors. But then you trust everything else that they publish. You're like, hey, wait a minute.
Exactly right.
There's a major disparity here.
It makes you question kind of everything in reality. Sort of, Plato's cave. Are we just looking at the shadows? Or
speaking to the context of schools, I really felt that you were that kid, like the smart kid in class they never called on because they always knew that David knew the answer. No. And then you finally got the chance, you're like, here are all of my citations. I've been keeping this silent for a year.
Well, it's important to me. The thesis in my book is that people kept making statements without supporting them. They would just say shit and just making it up. And I'm highly critical, rightfully so, of these people. So I would be a hypocrite if I then wrote a book and didn't include my own backup. So I tried to make it where there is nothing in this book, or close to nothing, that I claim that doesn't have a source in the back. I had far more extensive endnotes that my editor, mercifully for the reader, forced me to cut down, so they would have been even longer and more voluminous than they are.
A mere 70 pages-ish.
Yeah, that is just 70 pages of endnotes, but I mean, it would have been, at least 50% more.
Small type.
Which she cut down. So that's really important to me. Look, are most people going to go back and thumb through the endnotes? No. But for the small percentage of people who do care...
Well, I can certainly see, graduate students in public health schools studying this one day, and they're gonna want to go into the source notes.
There is a lot of fun stuff, sort of David Foster Wallace style in the endnotes as well. It's not just citations. It's me with some of them have a 500 word or 1,000 word aside where I'm explaining something in the endnotes, because 450 whatever pages in the normal part of the book wasn't sufficient.
Despite my degree in English, I could not get through Infinite Jest. But David Zweig, where can people find you?
You can find me at davidzweig.com. So DAVIDZWEIG. There are a couple other David Zweigs floating around the world. So, but I was early enough that I got davidzweig.com.
Nice.
So you can find me there. You can find me on X at David Zweig. And my newsletter is silentlunch.net. Silentlunch.net.
All right. So the book is An Abundance of Caution by David Zweig.
You gotta buy this book. You
gotta get this book.
Be the same.
You'll never be the same.
You will if nothing else, you will have bulging biceps from carrying it around because it's so large.
Quite the tome. I'm Benjamin Ryan. This is Hazard Ratio. You can find me, benryan.net, Ben Ryan Writer on Blue Sky and Twitter, and benryan.substack.com. Thanks a lot for joining me today, David.
Thanks, Ben.
Thanks.